we finally got a more expansive look at Breath of the Wild's sequel, and boy is there a lot here. Not just a cutscene this time around, but actual gameplay. Of course, we aren't here to just look at gameplay, no, we're here to dig into lore, translate text, and match up iconography. Yes, my friends, I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV, and it is time, once more, to see what we can learn about the sequel to Breath of the Wild's role in the Legend of Zelda timeline. Now, unlike our original teaser for Breath of the Wild 2, this trailer didn't start out with floating Gerudo text, just begging for a translation. In fact, on my first watch through, I didn't see any text to translate whatsoever, and I honestly thought I might be in for an easy evening. Then I watched it some more, and what do you know? I found some. So we'll start there. Now, like last time, we're going to break down our individual clues in the trailer before ultimately coming to any conclusions. The first bit of text we see is carved on whatever Link can be seen laying on in this scene. And this text is honestly unlike anything we've really seen in the Zelda universe thus far, but comparing it against every known Zelda language, it matches up closest with Gerudo, which kinda makes sense. This looks like the same room that we saw that swirling green text in last time. It isn't a perfect match, but we're able to make some decent guesses at pretty much every symbol here with a certain level of confidence. It's important to remember when translating Gerudo versus the various form of Hylian that we've seen, that we've only encountered one Gerudo alphabet, while Hylian has evolved greatly over the course of the timeline, so some inconsistencies should be expected just because we don't have a full picture, and this may simply be a different dialect or era of the language. Anyway, when translated, at first it just kind of looks like a random jumble of letters, with the only really pronounceable section being this bit in the middle that says something like Yabby. Not a whole lot to go on, but let's keep it in mind as we move forward. The one other instance of a written language in this trailer is on the pillars of this floating island. We'll talk more about the island itself later, but the language here appears to be the version of Hylian introduced in Wind Waker. Now, while Wind Waker itself takes place fairly late in the timeline, this version of Hylian has since been seen as early as Minish Cap. For those not familiar with the timeline, Minish Cap is currently the second game in the timeline taking place just after Skyward Sword, meaning this could be a very ancient structure. Now, this particular variant of Hylian is one of only a few that's based on Japanese rather than English. This means that when translating it, we can't go straight to English, but rather we have to take the phonetic translation and do our best to match that up with Japanese, and then translate that to English. So, yeah. Now, even in this small portion of the pillar, the text appears to repeat, so there isn't a ton here. But here's what I was able to make out. This first pillar, the one on the left, is referencing something that is made out of fire or born of fire, something that is of fire. The second pillar seems to reference some sort of a defensive structure like a moat or a trench. So altogether, we've got Yabby, something that is of fire, and a moat. Confused yet? Let's keep going. Getting away from translating text, something that's not at all uncommon in the Zelda series is iconography based on an eye. There's the Majora's Mask eye, which also seems to tie to the interlopers from Twilight Princess, the Sheikah eye, which is everywhere, and most recently the Malice eyes in Breath of the Wild. We see an eye symbol show up a few times across this trailer, and it's a very specific eye, but not any of those I've previously mentioned. You can see it here on Link's shield, and here on this, whatever this thing is. The eye belongs to one of the earliest villains in the timeline. This is the eye of Vaati. Vaati's earliest appearance in the timeline was in Minish Cap, though he also appeared in both Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures. Vaati himself was a Minish, a race of tiny beings who once lived in the sky above Hyrule. Vaati transformed himself into a human sorcerer in order to pursue the Light Force, an ancient power gifted to the humans by the Minish, or the Picori as they're also called. At the end of Minish Cap, after shedding his human form, Vaati took on the shape of an eyeball surrounded by a sort of dark fire, magic, smoke, something. His heraldry is often accompanied by a wind symbol, a symbol that looks very similar to the motifs we see on the floating islands in the trailer for Breath of the Wild 2. Before we get to what all of this would mean, let's go back to those translations. Our first translation of what appears to be a derivative of Gerudo said Yabi, or at least we think it does. The two symbols I translated as Ys aren't actually the exact same symbol, though they are very similar. I translated them both as Ys because in the only known Gerudo alphabet, a Y is the only letter that forks into 3 strokes at the bottom like this symbol does. Similarly, the B doesn't perfectly match up, but it's distinctly different from what I'm pretty confident is an A. Now, since we've been seeing signs of Vaati, it isn't unreasonable to compare what we believe to be something close to Yabi to Vaati. And here are some things to take note of. First of all, Vaati's name wasn't Vaati in the Japanese versions of the game, but rather Gufu. This means that there isn't an official translation of Vaati's name. It's also worth noting that there isn't a direct parallel for our V sound in Japanese, and other slightly different sounds are generally substituted instead. With that in mind, suddenly the jump from Yabi to Vaati doesn't seem that far. Is it 100% confirmed? No. We're working with a dialect we've never seen before, so my translations are going to have a certain margin for error. Luckily, this admittedly loose translation isn't all we have to go on. Let's revisit those 2 pillars for a couple reasons. Firstly, the translation itself. The first references something that is of fire. Made of fire, born of fire, it isn't clear. But if we look back at Vaati's most common form, keeping in mind that Breath of the Wild sports lots of evidence for being at the end of the child timeline, along which all 3 Vaati incidents would have occurred, we see a creature regularly depicted as being surrounded in a sort of dark flame. In fact, at the end of Minish Cap, Vaati is very literally surrounded by fire. Add to this that the particular dialect of Hylian used to write this inscription can be dated all the way back to Minish Cap, along with the patterns that appear very similar to Vaati's wind symbol, and it seems reasonable to suspect that Vaati has ties to whatever this structure is. The next pillar gives us some insight into the structure's purpose. It references a moat or a trench, in other words, a defensive barrier. Normally we think of these as being a way to keep something out, but in this instance, given the references to Vaati, a being who has escaped imprisonment multiple times, I think this is a barrier intended to keep something in, a seal. And you'll notice that the structure itself is broken. Pieces float in the sky high above Hyrule. This prison seems fit for a Minish, a race of beings who originally lived in the sky, a race that Vaati was a member of. Now before we go, let's briefly return to the original trailer. I've previously put forth arguments for this figure being both Ganondorf, sealed in this tomb after his defeat in Twilight Princess, as well as Aster, sealed here forever by Calamity Ganon, who used his powers to enter the physical realm. While it would be tempting to put forth the argument of this figure being Vaati's human form, that wouldn't explain the Gerudo heraldry, which is a perfect fit for both Astor and Ganondorf. So what ties could Vaati have to our dehydrated friend? Well, the last time we saw Vaati, Ganon was using him to resurrect himself, much like Astor was used by the Calamity. So while this whole time we'd naturally assume Vaati to be an enemy, it's also possible that he's seeking revenge not only on the chosen hero Link, but on Ganon himself. But what do you think? Did you notice anything I missed? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. You can find a whole lot more at NintendoWorldReport.com, and you can chat with us by joining our Discord. If you want to get a hold of me in particular, just give me a shout on Twitter at JTSKnight92. Once again, I'm John Reardon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.